We all know that the health care law has been widely debated. It will be a hot topic on the presidential trail leading into November. So tell us what it means today that the Supreme Court is going to begin hearing this.
Well, the court has obviously taken it seriously. It's scheduled 6 hours of argument over 3 days, starting today. The big event actually is tomorrow, a 2-hour argument over the centerpiece of the law, and the item that's most controversial, the requirement that most Americans carry health insurance or pay a penalty. The challengers, led by 26 Republican-controlled states and a small business lobbying group, say that that exceeds Congress's constitutional authority to regulate interstate commerce. The government says, no, it doesn't. It's a natural adjunct to the government's authority over health insurance and health care, and a mechanism for financing health care in this country.
And Professor, this goes back, one of the key precedents here about the individual mandate goes back a number of decades to a case involving agricultural limits on farming. Could you explain that quickly and tell us how that applies in the individual mandate now?
Sure. Back in 1942, Roscoe Filburn was feeding grain to his cows, and that violated the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which said you can't grow too much grain. They set quotas to raise the price of grain. He said that's not interstate commerce, and therefore Congress can't prohibit me from feeding grain to my cows. The court disagreed, an opinion by Robert Jackson, and held that, well, it has a substantial effect on the national price of grain to feed grain to cows. In fact, the party stipulated back then it had a 20% effect on price, a big effect on price. And so Congress, to control that effect on price, can control something that's totally local and totally intrastate and not especially commercial. And naturally, that could be applied to a case where somebody does not buy insurance, even though that's obviously local. Your decision not to buy insurance takes place within a single state. It's not interstate commerce. And it's arguably not commercial, because you're not doing anything. Still, it has a big effect on insurance companies. And indeed, the Obama administration has doubled down on this claim because they're claiming the individual mandate is non-severable from the guaranteed issue provision. And that's going to be the big argument on Wednesday. But by making that point, Varelli, the Solicitor General, is essentially hammering home the idea that if you strike down the individual mandate, you're not going to be able to regulate insurance companies. Everybody in this case agrees Congress can regulate insurance companies. So if you can do one, he says you got to be able to do the other, because otherwise the insurance companies could either go bankrupt or raise premiums through the roof.
All right, and Jess, how do you handicap that the justices will come down on this?
Well, I think the range of votes we're looking for is between 5-4 and 8-1, based on what the justices have previously said or what we can expect from their prior positions. That means that on the right end of the court, most observers think that Justice Clarence Thomas, who's been very skeptical of the last 75 years of Supreme Court commerce jurisprudence, will oppose this mandate as exceeding congressional powers. On the other hand, the 4 more liberal members of the court have tended to defer to congressional judgments about economic matters, about regulating industries, and they're going to most likely say this really falls within congressional discretion if this is a good way to regulate healthcare or not. And the question is really for the other 4 conservative justices, with at least if you judge by the number of times his name is mentioned in the briefs of both sides, focuses on Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's mentioned more than 30 times by both sides in their filings before the court.
All right, Jess Braven, I know you have to get to the courthouse right now. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll be following you on this on WSJ.com. Professor, before we let you go, we want to know, is the court ruled on something like this before? Is there precedent? What should we be looking for, and is there any indication as to what might happen?
Well, you know, if you look at all the decisions where the court has upheld what's characterized as economic regulation, this is an easy case, which is why a lot of law profs and judges were skeptical that the court would ever strike this down, because this looks very economic. And the court has held back in the 90s that if you're regulating in an economic field, they will maximally defer to Congress. On the other hand, it is true that Congress has not forced people to do stuff pursuant to its commerce power. And that's where the plaintiffs are really resting their case, that this is a new regulatory technique. It's a new regulatory technique, however, for a very old regulatory mission, and for that reason, my guess is the court's going to uphold this law.
And challengers to this don't argue that states could have the ability to mandate something like this. They're just saying that the federal government should not get into this business.
The state's Massachusetts' law, which Mitt Romney has been criticized for promoting, is absolutely safe under this theory. This simply limits the federal government. It does nothing to protect anyone from an individual mandate imposed by a state.
Right.
And really, the other thing is, when is the decision actually going to be made, and how important are these oral arguments? I know people like to read the tea leaves, look at what the questions the justices asked, but when do we expect an actual decision, and how important are the next 3 days of oral arguments?
The decision will be this summer, and you know, on a case that's this widely briefed and it's this prominent, a slip-up in oral argument just doesn't matter. I should say there's one exception to that. If the Solicitor General gets up, as Judais got up in the 1990s, and can't offer a crisp answer to the question, what is the limit on Congress's power? Can you give me one example of something that Congress can't do? The U.S. government's in trouble, but I assure you Donald Verrilli is ready for that question.
Right. Great.
All right.